Good morning to all of you. Thank you for coming. I thought it was the right moment to share with you some of the momentous developments which have taken place in the last few weeks, actually few days, in the Somali peace process towards ending the transitional period by the target date of August 20th, 2012. As you are aware, a meeting has just ended in Addis Ababa of the principals who are the signatories of the roadmap of the Garowe Principles and the Galkayo Agreement. They signed another agreement called the Addis Ababa Agreement. The meeting started on Monday, the 20th, and actually ended yesterday morning, early hours of morning. But before that, I had traveled to New York to present the quarterly report of the Secretary General to the Security Council. This is a routine quarterly report and progress report on the peace process. But I went at a time when there were a number of sticking issues in the peace process, which I reported to the Council. One of those issues, or a number of these issues, were the preparations for convening a constituent assembly, which will be convened by the traditional elders in Mogadishu. The traditional elders were actually already gathering in Mogadishu. The total number we are seeking to bring to Mogadishu before I went to New York was 135. Some would say the known traditional leaders in Somalia are 68. But that number was doubled to make sure that the traditional leaders do represent not only the major clans, but the sub-clans as well as the sub-clans. And that's why the number came to 135. The traditional leaders are known. As you know, the Somalis are among societies that are very good in oral history and lineage history. Actually, from the age of 9, Somalis know and can recite as far back as 32 generations. It shouldn't be difficult, therefore, to know who your traditional leaders are. But as we were bringing the traditional leaders to Mogadishu, we realized that there were some contentious claims over who is the authentic traditional leader. We were assured by the authorities, both regional and federal authorities, that these were authentic leaders. But there was public criticism. Outcry would be too strong a word, but dissatisfaction that some of the traditional leaders were not authentic. It has been common in Somalia in the past 20 years for people to self-claim as elders, or some are imposters, some are self-made, or others are made out of convenience by politicians as elders. We were not looking for any elder or an elder, but a traditional elder. So it was important that we make sure there is a process of validating the authenticity of the traditional origins of these elders. So one of the issues I report to the council was that there is a dispute over the authenticity of the elders who have gathered in Mogadishu. The number was not very high that was contested. It was about 10% or 90% was fine. And let me point out the significance of bringing these traditional leaders. We are bringing them to perform two functions. One is to select representatives and delegates to the Constituent Assembly. Why the traditional elders? Because in the absence of direct elections or a referendum, the most legitimate representative of the people are these elders. And they are coming to perform two functions in Mogadishu. The first one is to provisionally adopt a provisional constitution. Ideally, this constitution should have been adopted by a referendum. But because of the security situation, which doesn't permit access to the rest of the country, and we need to have this constitution adopted as one of the requirements of both the Mbagati Agreement and the Djibouti Agreement to end the transition, we need some kind of an authentic authority to adopt this interim or provisional constitution. And these are the authority that will give us the representatives. Who are the representatives to come and adopt this constitution? There are 7 focal groups representing Somali civil society, coming from each of the 4.5 major clans in Somalia. Who are they? They are the religious leaders, women, business community, youth, intellectuals and professionals, and the diaspora. And until this week, it was also the traditional elders. As you can see, these are focal groups that represent grassroots representation or major constituencies of the civil society in the 4.5 respective clans. And we thought, in the absence of a referendum, there couldn't be a better and more authentic representation and authority legitimate to approve the interim constitution. But then, if there was a contention over the authenticity, even if by 1%, we wouldn't have been having the right kind of elders to give us that Constituent Assembly. Secondly, these elders were going to perform another function, and that is to select members of a new parliament, 225 new parliamentarians, while the members of the Constituent Assembly are 825. So if we got wrong with the traditional elders, we would have it wrong with the Constituent Assembly, we would have it wrong with the new parliament. So I told the Security Council we have to address this issue. The second issue, which was still contentious, was the finalization of the draft constitution. It is a draft constitution which will be provisionally adopted by the Constituent Assembly, and it is itself a provisional draft. because it's not the end but the beginning of the dialogue on the Constitution, which should begin in the Constituent Assembly but will continue after the end of the transition in August. Now, this minimal document, which by agreement requirement has to be presented to the Constituent Assembly, was still contentious. It was still in the process of being finalized. There were issues that need to be discussed in the Constituent Assembly now, and there are issues that need to be discussed after August. We had not fully agreed to delineate the essentials of the draft Constitution and those issues that have to be parked, bracketed, and carried forward after August. So I let the Council know that this issue is to be resolved, and it could only be resolved by the principals or the signatories to the agreements. Like the first issue also could only be resolved by the principals. There was a third contentious issue. As these elders engage in selecting the members of the Constituent Assembly, and later engage in selecting the members of Parliament, are we satisfied that however authentic they are is enough? We were thinking of a process that would not only help the elders, but could also help to vet the numbers of the candidates to both bodies, the Constituent Assembly and Parliament. This was called, we agreed in Galkayo, a body called the Technical Selection Committee. A body that was to be nominated by the principals, but there was a contention around that. Are they going to be representatives of the signatories? Is this not an indirect way of manipulating the process and influencing the traditional elders as they select the delegates to these two bodies? So we had to find a way of making this Technical Selection Committee as neutral or as technical, as non-political as possible. And this is another issue which had to be resolved by the principals. I also had to inform the Council that Parliament remains paralyzed since December. We are heading towards the end of the transition. The Charter has to be amended to allow the convening of the Constituent Assembly. There are some critical pieces of legislation that Parliament had to undertake or to pass, but since Parliament was paralyzed, we have to find an alternative legislative procedure in order to maintain the legal basis of ending the transition and the legal basis of making these major decisions on convening the Constitution, or convening the Constituent Assembly, and forming a new Parliament. So I told the Council we are looking for alternative legal continuity as an alternative to the non-functioning Parliament. And I said, I'm going back to the region. We are convening a meeting of the signatories, or we call them principals. But convening this principles itself was an issue. From the 6th of September last year, when we adopted the roadmap, there was an understanding that everything else will be related to the ending of the transition will be held in Mogadishu, or in Somalia, to be more specific. From Mogadishu, we went to Garowe twice, we went to Galkayo. Now this time, we needed a principals meeting. Where do we go? The majority of the principals say, we go to Mogadishu. But one principal said, no, we don't go to Mogadishu because of security reasons. But also, in addition to security difficulties, this was in the wake of the bombing in the National Theatre. There was some fears. We tried to give assurances, which we are giving to the elders in Mogadishu, and all of us who live in Mogadishu. There is, of course, risks. But it became an issue. But Puntland also had another argument, that maybe this is such an important meeting. Let's go to a place like Addis Ababa, the seat of the African Union, the seat of IGAD, and even if these bodies are not part of the elders, but they'll be around to witness what we are saying and what we are doing. Finally, the principals agreed that instead of having this meeting in Mogadishu, we go to Addis Ababa. So we went to Addis Ababa. There was another issue, which I didn't bring to the council, but the council brought to me. They said, congratulations, SRSG, together with your colleagues of the African Union and IGAD, for issuing a letter of warning to spoilers or potential spoilers to the peace process. We had just issued a letter 10 days before I traveled to New York. And by spoilers, we meant not legitimate political dissent, but conscious, systematic effort to scuttle, to obstruct the peace process. And this initially meant some elements in Parliament who had actually even been behind the violence and the obstruction. But now it had gone beyond that. There were some elders of some clans, there were some business communities, there were some clandestine organized groups that were deliberately obstructing the peace process. And we sent out a warning. And the council asked me, what is the next step after you warn? First of all, they said, has the warning worked? I said, it has worked. After we issued the warning, there has been remarkable silence. And people have, who we know, have gone underground. We don't see the threat they were posing before. But the council said, what is the next step? We said the next step would be to name those. In consultation with the Somalia-Eritrea Monitoring Group, we have suspects. And we are going, if they continue, we are going to name them and start investigating them. And we shall tell them, you are under investigation for this and that. And the third step would be, if they continue, to ask the countries of the region, with the blessing of the Security Council, to impose sanctions on those individuals or groups. And the most effective sanctions would be travel ban to start with, to the countries of the region. To Kenya, to Ethiopia, to Djibouti, to Uganda. We would also want to include Dubai. But we haven't reached that stage. This is what I informed the council. So now we go to Addis. What did we do in Addis? First of all, the elders. These signatories all met. And the United Nations is among the signatories. So I was sitting with them all the time. We started addressing the issue of the traditional elders. We went through the list. The principles said it's not 90%. Actually, it is 95% correct. But we insisted that even the 5% has to be validated. How do we validate this? There are three ways of validation. The first one was to publish the whole list to the general public. But that would mean establishing a secretariat to start and collating the views, but also there was a security risk. At this stage, although the elders eventually will be known, this would have been like publicizing a hit list for Shabab. So we said, this is time consuming and it's risky. The second method was, let's look for eminent Somalis in Somalia or outside Somalia who will tell us who are the authentic leaders. But again, this would be time consuming. But we agreed that the elders themselves are the true people who can tell us who are their peers. So they engage in some kind of a peer review. And we agreed that they establish an arbitration board among themselves to authenticate the remaining 5% of the elders. So that one was agreed upon. So that's no longer an issue. And we said this has to be done within 5 days from yesterday. So we hope the validation will be completed within 5 days. After this validation, should they proceed to start the process of nominating the delegates to the Constituent Assembly? The principal said no. Actually, Puntland had called back their elders from Mogadishu. Not in protest, but to say these elders, once we have identified them, have to go back to their respective constituencies to begin the process of consultation in selecting the representatives of the focal groups of their respective civil society from their respective clans. And we say this should happen within 20 days. So they are going back. After we have verified them in 5 days, they are going back to their regions. Those who cannot go back because some are coming from behind the lines or from Shabab-controlled areas, they use other means, like the cell phone and this. But it is important that they are given time to consult with their respective constituencies in the selection of these members of the Constituent Assembly. But the principals also agreed that I mentioned to you 7 focal points. They said no. The elders, once they have selected the members of the Constituent Assembly, they themselves should not be members of the Constituent Assembly to approve the draft constitution. So that has been addressed and resolved. The second issue was about the constitution. We finally had a draft which was given to the principals by the 30th of April. But there wasn't an agreement on which issues should be discussed now in the Constituent Assembly and which issues will be discussed later. The leaders set a technical committee from day one, which sat for the 3 days. They were going through the draft and identifying issues, but also incorporating comments from the respective signatories into the draft. We finalized that draft. We agreed on which issues to be parked, which issue to be bracketed, and which to be submitted to the Constituent Assembly as a framework for discussion. Unfortunately, I do not have yet the English version of that, but it should be available anytime today. I can share with you. And this is the document which will be presented to the Constituent Assembly. On the Technical Selection Committee, we agreed that it should not be a representative of the signatories. It should be a representative of the clans, which will be the gatekeeper and the body assisting the traditional leaders in the selection of the civil society members of the Constituent Assembly. So the number has been increased to 27. But also ANPOS has been given 2 seats in that Technical Selection Committee. In addition, but ANPOS will not be a voting member, but it will be in the Technical Selection Committee. But in addition, there will be observers from the international community. Initially, it was 6 observers, but I argued for 7 observers from the international community, because there were some contentious issues among the international community. Who would represent the international community? There was an understanding that it will only be the regional organizations, African Union, IGAD, League of Arab States, European Union, Organization of Islamic States. Now we have 2 more seats. I think the international community will have to decide how they want to use that. So that issue has been also agreed upon. On the legal continuity, in the absence of Parliament, the leaders have agreed that protocols should be prepared and adopted, which will empower the President to issue presidential decrees with the political backing of the signatories that will amend the Charter to convene the Constituent Assembly, and by so doing dissolve the current Parliament. But it will also empower the President to sign a decree on the establishment of the National Security Stabilization Plan, which had been pending for the past almost 6 months. But it will also empower the President to issue any other protocols that will be necessary for the management of the Constituent Assembly. And this Technical Selection Committee was given another task, not only vetting and acting as a gatekeeper, but the management of the Constituent Assembly. I think the details of this agreement have been issued to you of the Addis Ababa communique. I hope you have all looked at it. But I thought I should give you this rather lengthy background to explain to you what has transpired in the Security Council and what has transpired in Addis Ababa and the way forward. Most important, of course, was to revise the timetable. On the 20th, when we met, we had exactly 90 days to the 20th of August. The principals have revised the timetable for finishing the transition. And we are working backwards, not extending. From the 20th of August, working backwards. We are already late because the Constituent Assembly was supposed to meet on the 15th of May. So we have squeezed everything in that space. And they had to take full responsibility to revise the timetable. We hope In between, there are going to be other developments in the international community. One is the international conference in Istanbul on Somalia from the 1st to the 2nd of June, which is co-sponsored by the Turkish government and the United Nations. The Prime Minister of Turkey will be co-chairing with Ban Ki-moon on this conference. So that also has to be factored in. There will be the International Contact Group meeting, which regularly meets, and we need it after Istanbul, which is this time scheduled to take place in Rome. There are some overlaps on the date in Rome and the date which the principles have assigned, but we wanted the principles first and foremost not to begin with exceptions. We say, don't touch this date because it is Istanbul. Don't touch this date because it is Rome. No. We gave priority to them. Then we shall see how in between these dates can be adjusted. They are not cancelling Istanbul. They are not cancelling Rome. But we thought, an adjustment of 1 or 2 days can be done. But what was important is that we have a fixed program, adjustable and flexible, but the date of 20th remain immutable, and 20th August to end the transition. It is time for action. It is time to invest. 90 days minus 3 days already. We are 87 days, and work has to begin and has begun. There was a passionate appeal for resources and support from the international community. We're very grateful that resources are beginning to come. Checks are being written, but money may not yet arrive, but expenditure is going on. But I think there is very good response from the international community, and I want to appreciate that. And within 90 days, we shall definitely hope to complete. On the 20th of August, we shall have the election of the president. We may not. Then from there, the president, on the 21st, will appoint a prime minister and then form a government, and that will be another phase. But the 20th is the date for the election of the president by a new parliament. A new parliament with a new criteria, leaner in size, a criteria that will give a qualitative difference to the members of parliament by the benchmarks that were established in Garowe 1 and Garowe 2. Thank you very much.